Hey everybody, this is Brother Milan again with the YouTube channel Clad with Zeal. If you have not already done so, go ahead and hit that subscribe button down below. But today I'm just going to go ahead and start that new series that I was talking about in my last video, which is my review on the book Teaching on Preaching by Dr. Jack Hyles. Now, I've kind of done a little bit more explaining about what I'm going to be talking about in my previous video. So if you haven't already seen that, I suggest you should probably check it out to kind of see, where this whole thing is going. It'll give you more details on that. But just to make sure we're in line with the time frame that I set and the expectation for that, I'm going to get right into it. So basically, we're going to go over chapter number 1, which is titled One Great Truth, a Sermon. So in his book, I find some very interesting things that I do want to highlight, things I want to talk about in reference to maybe some changes that I've made to my preaching when I have the opportunity to stand behind a pulpit, and then just, basically my thoughts on some of the comments that are made. I find this chapter to be very helpful, and I know that this chapter is extremely important. I think this is really something that can separate a good sermon from a bad sermon. And what I mean by that is sometimes when you're either preparing a sermon or delivering a sermon, if the preacher is all over the place and not actually finding a destination, the congregation is going to walk away overwhelmed. And even though there may be a lot of Bible being taught and a lot of doctrine being taught, I feel like if you don't have that specific destination, they're going to basically be lost throughout the sermon. And I'll kind of show you some ways that I try to improve to make sure that I keep it to, that one great truth per sermon. Doesn't mean you can't go on rabbit trails. Doesn't mean that you can't, compare scripture with scripture. What it means is that the point of the sermon that you're making, you're emphasizing that. And let me read for you this quote from this book, or just a piece from this book that kind of expounds on why you should do that. And in chapter number 1, in page number 1, it says, "I believe that the fondest hope that a preacher can have concerning retention of his sermons is to attempt to leave one great truth a sermon in the minds of his people." Listen to this. "The average person will not remember much of what the preacher has said. Most people will not remember his outline." And being able to participate in both sides, as in the congregation and also being able to preach a full-length message, you can see the polar opposites. As a preacher standing behind a pulpit, and the hours that you put in to prepare for that sermon, the hours of meditation that you have, the study that you put into it, because you are concerned with delivering that sermon the best that you can do. I feel like the preacher, and including myself in my own experience, I know my outline in and out. Even before I step on the pulpit, I may change things as I'm preaching, and I'm sure as I get better, I'm sure other experts out there that are better preachers than I am, or they're actually pastors, they could, preach more off the cuff, but they still know their outline very well. What's different though is, as a listener, the listener, unless they're writing down and being told, hey, this is my first point, or this is my second point. If you're just simply listening, you can easily get lost. Now, it doesn't mean you're not learning. If you're really paying attention, you're probably learning other things outside of that one great truth. Maybe you pick up a Bible story that you needed to refresh on, or there's a specific point that is segueing into the main one truth. You'll pick up things along the way. But the one thing that you will retain is that one great truth. And one way that I do that, and one way I've been taught by Brother Bruce, is to reiterate your title. And your title, in my opinion, should coincide with that one great truth. So for example, let's say you're preaching on, how to have a better marriage, or strengthening your marriage. That's the one great truth. You want to title it as such. Now, you can make it a little fancy or whatever, but what you want to do is basically, reiterate that title, or tie that title in, multiple times in the sermon, to remind those people listening, hey, this is what I want you to understand about this. This is how I want you to have a better marriage, or this is why marriage is important, or whatever the topic is. But I did struggle with this in the beginning, and it's something that I meditated on, I thought about, and I thought, obviously I'm on a different perspective now because I'm the one preaching, I'm not the one listening, and I know a lot more about my sermon than the congregation does. So how am I going to deliver this and be effective? Well, I may have overdone it in one of my sermons in particular, which was when God fills in the gap. I do feel like I overdid it, and I maybe need to draw back a little bit because I was kind of using it every point. I was kind of saying, I'd say my statement or quote the verse and explain the verse, and then I would say, but God fills the gap or something like that. Now you don't have to do that many times, but throughout the sermon you want to mention and tie it back to the original point so people understand, oh, okay, I know where he's going with this. And what does that help do? It helps it be retained in the mind of the congregation. So when you repeat those things, when you are repetitive, it gets instilled in the mind, because people need to hear things more than once in order to learn sometimes. It's just different for everybody, but I think that is a great point, and I think that makes for better preaching. So I totally agree with that point in this first portion of the chapter. Another quick thing that I wanted to mention here about One Great Truth, a sermon, is in I think it's page number 20 on the first chapter still. There's a highlighted point that says, place the truth at the top of your prayer list. And this is something I've actually done before I even read this book, before I really had any advice on how to preach. This is something I thought about even before my first sermon. I thought to myself, hey, if I ever have an opportunity to preach, I want to make sure that I'm asking God and praying about this one great truth before I either write my sermon or, obviously before you deliver it as well. But I think God, it's very helpful when you put God first and you ask him to maybe see what the needs of the congregation is and see what that one great truth can be. And then I'll read for you in this little portion underneath that bullet point. It says, every time you go to the throne of grace, you will be reminded of your sermon for Sunday, and you will pray fervently for God to help you to convey properly to your people the truth that he has led you to choose in order for them to arrive at the destination which he has chosen for them. And obviously when we're preaching, it's a spiritual matter, so I find that to be a very important point in this, is don't forget when you're preaching to be asking God, what the congregation needs. Now, I'm not saying that it's any sort of Pentecostal, miracle where just every Sunday the congregation is going to get exactly what they need. No, we need to teach the whole counsel of God. However, I feel like God does line up, specific times and days and things for people to need to hear this, or the congregation needs to hear a specific point, but it also just supports that one great truth, and it helps align the sermon the way God wants it to when we're asking him for that provision. So those are really the only two things that I wanted to mention in regards to actually preparing and preaching. Real quick though, I guess one last thing that I wanted to say was that on page number 24, and this will be the last one, it says, and this is actually when you're writing the sermon, so this is a little bit different than meditating on it or delivering it rather. It says, have the truth that is being emphasized written boldly somewhere in the outline. And this is something that I actually picked up from this book, and this helped me a lot because it helped me go back and remember, hey, I need to say this again. I need to reiterate my title. I need to reiterate the main point. I need to reiterate and explain over and over again what I want the destination of this preaching to be. I want people to clearly understand why I'm preaching on this and what people need to change or what people need to believe for it to be an effective sermon. So I thought that was great, and what I do is basically I did exactly what it shows us, is basically boldly, I type out my sermons, but I always bolden that and I copy and paste it throughout the sermon where I feel like it fits. So if I'm talking about like, I'm going to keep it general. Obviously, you're more specific to whatever sermon you're writing. But let's say you're preaching on or preaching against fornication or fornication in the church. Then let's say your title is like fornication is wicked, or just something general like that. I know it's not a good title, like very crafty, but we're using it for an example. So let's just say, the title of your sermon is fornication is wicked. So when you're going through, that is your title. What I do is I just copy and paste my title to remind myself to repeat that phrase so people get it instilled in their mind. So I don't have to go back to the first page. I only do one-sided sheets, so I'm basically flipping pages when I'm done, so I don't have to read the back of a page, or it helps me not get lost basically in my sermon. So then I don't have to flip back and say, oh, okay, while I'm thinking through a different thought or I'm going down a rabbit trail, I can always refer back and say, oh, hey, and this is another reason why, fornication is wicked, X, Y, and Z. So I put that throughout the sermon. Obviously, I've had times where I've overdone it, and then times where I haven't done it at all, and I wait till the end. And I think there needs to be a healthy balance, but it's a very helpful tip for new preachers and even those who are still trying to figure out if they want to preach, that they can kind of refer to that. But that's the good things that I found from, obviously there's many more, but specifically for that chapter, those are the things that I took away. And I hope that was helpful for you. And hopefully I can implement more of that into the next opportunity I get to preach. But I hope you guys enjoyed the first part of this series. This is chapter number 1. Next week we'll hit chapter number 2 all the way to 17. And hopefully I can get some new ideas for this as far as changing it up and adding different things. But we'll go along with it together. And I thank you guys so much for watching. And remember to stay clad with zeal.